Sophia Lane. I'm president of the Cabrillo Unified School District Governing Board. I'm here tonight with our fearless new superintendent, Sean McFettridge. So, what we're talking about today is the mystery and hopefully demystification of public school funding. So first, I want to make sure we put a big shout out to our amazing co-sponsors for this event. You see them here: Cabrillo Education Foundation, Rotary, Coastside Mothers Club, Coastsiders for Better Education Funding, Coastside Advocacy, Friends of the Library, Half Moon Bay Coastside Chamber of Commerce, and AAUW. And of course, our lovely hosts for the evening, the Half Moon Bay Library. Thank you so much. So our objective for today is to increase the community awareness and understanding of how California public school funding works and what it means for the Cabrillo Unified School District community so that we can maximize resources and unify the support for student success. So that's what we're here for. So our agenda, we're going to use probably the full 2 hours that we have allocated, with a good chunk of it towards the end for questions and answers. We want to sure you have questions. We want to do our best to try to answer them. And then time to mingle at the end with one another, with us, with our sponsors who, as you may have seen, are set up on tables around the room. So you'll have some time to work with them, all of whom are supporters and do a lot of work already on a daily basis supporting our students. So I'll give a brief introduction on school funding in California, and then turn it to our keynote speaker, Dr. McFettridge, to speak about the implications for our school district. And then we will bring up a panel and talk about, what we all can do or different ways to think about what we can do to help. Which of course is unique to each one of us. And then we'll spend about half an hour on questions and answers. You have pieces of paper on your chair, hopefully, and a pencil. We put those there so that you can, as questions come up in your mind during the course of the presentation, you can jot them down, and then we'll save them at the end just so we can make sure we have time for everything. Also, if you're less than comfortable speaking in front of 80 people or so are in this room, we'll have a couple folks walking around collecting those cards. You can hand it to them and we'll collate and just get them off instead. So, and then we'll, network a little bit, socialize. So, without further ado, let's talk about school funding in California. All right, so first we're going to start with a quick history lesson because this is like a school thing, right? So we're talking about the school thing, we have to learn about where we were to learn more about how we got here. So let's take a quick look. Bear with me a second. Is this working?
Strong schools make strong communities. Most Americans go through the public school system, and we know a good education is essential for getting a decent job, supporting a family, and contributing as a citizen in our democracy. But did you know that all the other states spend more per student on education than California? In fact, in recent years, California spent about $2,800 less per student than the national average. In every other state, teachers, librarians, and guidance counselors teach and support fewer students, so each student can get more attention. Why is this? How do schools in California get their funding, and who decides how much? Most of the money for schools comes from the taxes collected from people and businesses. You pay sales tax on the items you buy, income tax on the wages you earn or the profits a business makes, and property taxes on buildings and land. In an average California school district, state and local property taxes make up about 78% of school funding, whereas the U.S. government, the lottery, and local revenues like interest and fundraisers make up the rest. The amount of money your local school district gets is linked to the number of students in each grade, certain student characteristics, and student attendance. When students are absent a lot, schools lose money. So how come California schools don't have enough money? Let's take a look at how schools were funded in the 1970s when California schools were considered to be excellent, and per student spending was consistently above the national average. Local property taxes made up 60% of the funding for schools, and the state contributed about 34%. Then, in 1978, Proposition 13 was passed, which slashed property taxes by an average of 60%. limited property tax rate increases for residential and commercial property, and eliminated the ability for school districts to increase their property tax rates for school programs. Quickly, school funding in California fell below the national average, and a few years later, in 1988, voters passed another law, Proposition 98. This law provides a protected portion of the state budget for schools, and when the economy improves, school funding improves with it. Unfortunately, 2 years later, Proposition 111 modified Proposition 98 to include provisions which allow the Proposition 98 guarantee to decrease in years when the state budget shrinks. Even after all of this, California per-student spending is still well below the national average. In 2012, the California Teachers Association, Governor Brown, and many others supported Proposition 30, which provides a temporary modest increase in sales tax and an increase in personal income tax for very high earners. California schools were able to avoid drastic cuts in 2012-13 and see significant revenue increases in 2013-14 due to revenues from Proposition 30. But portions of Proposition 30 revenues are set to expire beginning in 2016, and California schools are still funded below the national average. How do we get more funding for schools? Clearly, Proposition 13 hurt public school funding, and it has never really recovered. Proposition 98 gives schools a guaranteed portion of the state budget pie, but the state budget isn't always reliable. What can we do about it? Voters and the public need to rethink Proposition 13. Most people don't realize that before Proposition 13, commercial and residential property taxes were about evenly divided. Today, residential property taxes make up over 70% of the tax revenue from property taxes. That means people, not businesses, are paying more of the taxes, and that was never the stated intent of Proposition 13, keeping grandma from losing her home when property values soared. How do we grow the state budget revenue pie? Close tax loopholes, expanding the tax base, increased economic development, increasing tax rates. Everything should be on the table for discussion about how to make sure the 8th largest economy in the world can support the public services its citizens want and need. Remember, well-funded schools with successful students are a public good and help build strong communities. Understanding how California schools are funded can help you become a better advocate for students in your community.
I'm going to take a quick pause also, just a housekeeping note. If anybody who doesn't already have the interpretation devices would require one, please see Leticia in the back there, and she will gladly help you. She's running it as we speak. So hopefully that's a good flavor of some of the topics we'll be discussing today, kind of a nice little cartoon. We're going to get a little bit more into the details here over the next few minutes. Firstly, how do California public schools get funded? So a little bit as you heard, basically the state determines the formulas that fund public schools in the state. In our state, the public schools are primarily funded through state and local property taxes, so around 75% or so, of course varies school by district by district. There are contributions from federal and other local sources as well. Parcel taxes, grants, donations, and the like. So how this happens is actually a little bit more complicated, so we'll spend a few minutes talking about that. Basically because the state sets what they call minimum per student spend levels, and that's based on the student population, both your total number of students that you have enrolled in your district, as well as the certain demographics that we're alluding to earlier, which we'll get into. So that's the minimum, but the actuals often, almost always, differ from those minimum levels. So, and those actual amounts of money that are spent per student vary a lot, district to district, and that variability is based largely on different local property tax revenues. So as a result of these formulas, the bottom line, as we heard, slightly updated from the data that we saw there, California, with most analyses, ranks 41st among the states, despite being the 5th largest economy in the world. So a note is today our focus is on operational budgets. As many people are aware, budgets for other certain types of activities like facilities construction and things along those lines by law are managed separately. So we're talking about operational budgets today. Okay, so let's talk about these minimum school funding levels. So schools receive a certain amount of funding per student, which is called base funding. So that amount varies by grade level. So you can see the levels here for 2016, 2017, pretty similar today. Also happen to be pretty similar in 2007, which is funny enough, if you like that joke. So that's the base funding that all districts are required to spend. Depending on the number of students that you have that fit in certain categories, English learners, homeless, foster kids, as well as low-income students in low-income families, as assessed by the free reduced price lunch form that everybody fills out at the beginning of the year, districts are required to spend an additional 20% for each one of those kids, unduplicated. So that means if they fit multiple categories, they just can't get counted once. For districts that have 55% or more of students fitting those criteria, they get an additional bolus of funding, which is 50%. So if you exceed that 55% threshold, which our district does not, we're at about 45%, 42, 43, just kind of shy of that qualification for the concentration funding, you don't get that additional money. So that's how the minimum school funding levels are set. So what happens in actuality or in reality? So some districts generate more than that. Let's say your magic number, you plug it in the formula and you need to spend $11,000 per student per year. But your property tax revenues allow you to spend 25. Guess what? You get to spend 25. Less a small like 4% fee that you need to pay into a pot of money. But pretty much you get to spend the bulk of that excess that you generate. So what about other districts that don't raise that much money, that $11,000 per year per student? The state will supplement you up to that minimum amount. So our district, Calabria Unified, and Sean will speak to this a little bit more in detail later, is in that second category, which is often called state funded, as opposed to community funded, which many other districts around us are. So what does San Mateo County look like, right? It's generally across the country considered a wealthy school district, but actually quite heterogeneous when you look at the numbers. So you can see here some tables from a recent report from San Mateo County, link is below. But you can see a lot of variability, and Calabria Unified is the 6th lowest overall funded among the districts in the county. And among the unified school districts, which are a little bit more apples to apples because the grade split is more similar, it's the lowest. So similar other sources of funding tend to mirror that, what we call LCFF funding, which is the acronym for Local Controlled Funding Formula, if you are curious, if you like acronyms. So for example, parcel taxes are pretty similar spread where, similarly for Cabrillo, we have the 6th lowest overall and kind of in the middle among the unifieds there. So other funding sources as well, donations, foundation contributions, and so on, tend to mirror those and sometimes be even more divergent. So a lot of this ends up resulting in inequities and insufficiencies for a lot of school districts. There are 3 main factors that come into play here. One is that the funding formula that we just talked about does not account for geographic cost of living differences. So whether you're in the Bay Area or Bakersfield, 11K is 11K, which we know our employees are paying different amounts for housing and pretty much everything else. And everything else costs a different amount of money, but there's no compensation for that formula. Secondly, as briefly alluded to earlier, the funding levels are pretty similar to those in 2007, 2008. So pre-recession of 2008, we kind of got back to those levels recently, slowly over time, and now we're back to where we were 12 years ago. That's awesome, right? Because everything costs the same as it did 12 years ago, right? Ooh, no, not really. That's where we are. So that's number 2. Thirdly, is that concentration grant level set, which is a 55%, which doesn't have a lot of particular rationale around it, other than like a lot. And so districts, if you could be at 54%, you don't get that funding. So that's interesting as well. So what does this look like in reality, right? So I made some examples earlier. We have our happy neighbors at Woodside Elementary, which we often look to as a contrast because demographically very different of a community. Generate a lot of revenues in local property taxes. So they're one of those examples that I mentioned earlier that is fortunate enough to be fully funded because they generate enough property tax revenues that they can fund their schools. So their state minimum is much lower than 25, but they are able to spend 25K. And by the way, it's interesting side note, they're required to spend it. Even if they really like us and think we're really cool and awesome and need it, they can't share it with us. So by law, it's not because they're mean, it's just by law. So that's interesting as well. Average across San Mateo County is 13,000 per student per year, and Premier Unified is 11, which I happened to mention earlier. So interestingly, and I pulled out an example here, we pulled out an example here also from Barstow Unified, again, much lower cost of living area where $35,000 per year income is considered the cutoff for low income, as opposed to San Mateo County, which is around 117, varies a little bit each year. Same 11K. Okay, so just in case it's not clear, this basically results in California not funding its schools. Pretty much any way you look at it, we're in the bottom 20% of investment in our students. Okay, so we have another video here. It's a little bit long, but PBS does a really good job explaining what happens when school districts don't have enough money, so I hope you guys can bear with us. And it's about 7 minutes, so assuming all goes well technically and we get it going, let's give this a shot because this will be the transition then to what Dr. McPetridge will speak about.
State takeover, insolvency, school budget disaster. We've all seen startling headlines in recent years about some school districts across California. But what does it all mean?
We're 41st in the nation in what we spend per kid. In California, I mean, the richest state, in the richest nation on the face of the earth. And the pathetic funding that we have per pupil is something that's got to be dealt with.
With more than 6 million students and 1,100 school districts, California has the largest public school system in the country. But some school districts are struggling financially.
Will you see more enter into this general category of fiscal distress? Yes, you will.
We've enjoyed the longest economic growth period in California since World War II. Yet hundreds of school districts are cutting their budgets. So what's the problem here? The problem here is that what we're not doing in a growing economy is investing in education. We're just not doing it.
According to many in education, the problem also has to do with the state increasing the financial burden on districts at a time when many districts face declining revenue. While each district faces unique challenges, experts agree there are some common factors contributing to the budget crisis in California's schools. Factor number one, the pension system.
Most teachers are in the CalSTRS system, and Jerry Brown, the governor at the time a few years ago, realized, of course we need to put more money into the system. So they raised the contribution for districts over time so that districts would have time to build that increase into their budget.
That increase will more than double what districts are required to contribute to employee pensions, going from 8.3% of their payroll in the 2013-2014 school year to 19.1% by 2021.
They want you to have the money today for the person that you hire today so that when they retire, the money will be there.
In his first year in office, California Governor Gavin Newsom pledged $3 billion to help offset the large increase in pension costs school districts are having to pay. District officials say it's a step in the right direction, but it still isn't enough. Contributing factor number 2, declining enrollment.
About 60% of school districts in California are declining enrollment, and that's a significant issue because their revenue from the state is tied to enrollment and attendance.
Many parents in financially strapped districts are moving their kids to charter or private schools, and it's happening at a rapid pace. Adding to the financial pressure is the way schools are funded, on a per-pupil, per-day basis. For each child who misses a day at school, the district receives less money, even though they're paying the same amount for the teacher and the classroom. Contributing factor number 3, the increasing cost of everything.
We are seeing increased costs on so many fronts. We're experiencing an increase in our pension costs. We are experiencing an increase in our healthcare costs. We are also seeing an increase just in the cost of doing business.
According to Sacramento Unified School District officials, those increases have put them $35 million in the red.
Currently, Sac City Unified spends 91 cents of every dollar on employee benefits and salaries, and we're trying to work with our labor partners to lower that to the state average of 86 cents per dollar, or even lower if we can.
The simple solution seems to be, well, the largest chunk of the budget are teacher salaries, so let's cut teacher salaries and we'll save the money. That's not the solution, and very rarely is.
There are consequences if they don't ultimately stabilize.
Michael Fine leads the organization tasked with keeping school districts out of financial trouble. It's called FCMAT, which stands for Fiscal Crisis and Management Assistance Team. They work with troubled districts to find options for recovery. Districts that still struggle after several FCMAT warnings may face what many call a state takeover. The official term, insolvency.
When a school district has insufficient cash doing payroll and they have exhausted all of their cash borrowing options, then that's the definition of insolvency.
At that point, the district is forced to ask the state for a loan. That loan triggers a transfer of governing authority. Until the fall of 2018, that authority was transferred to the state. That's why you hear it called a state takeover. In 2018, the process was changed, giving counties the authority and requiring them to appoint an outside administrator to govern the district.
Generally, the superintendent is dismissed, and that administrator that the county superintendent assigns then becomes the board, the superintendent, and they go to work solving the budget problems.
They look at cutting all expenses that aren't mandatory.
Higher class sizes, fewer resources for the students, all those kinds of things. And then it also burdens the district with loans that take them years to pay off.
Well, state takeover would be not good for our students or families, and that's why we're trying to do everything we can to avoid it.
Officials familiar with the process say insolvency ends up costing school districts far more after paying back the loan and millions of dollars in interest. There's also concern that an outside administrator would be focused on the fiscal solvency of the district and not on the classroom.
The main concern as a parent is for the long term, the future students coming into the Sac City Unified School District.
There's been talk that if the state takes over, then we'll have a lot less money than we already do right now. And if that happens, then we're going to have to make a lot of cuts with all the people leaving. I mean, you're just going to be left with, schools that are not well taken care of, and then now you've got maybe less, teachers and other cutbacks, and so bigger class sizes. So yeah, it's just going to be a horrible situation.
But despite what sounds like a gloomy situation, experts in education say there are signs that the tide could be turning. They're actually optimistic.
It gives me great optimism to see a governor who says in his State of the State address, the first governor in decades to actually acknowledge that we've got a problem with per pupil funding and something has to be done about it.
Since 1991, we've had 9 school districts and 1 community college district that didn't respond to the intervention. To have 9 in 27, 28 years, I think is probably a pretty good record. It's actually a reflection that the system's working.
I believe that we are on the verge, because of all the changes we've made, of doing some really exciting things in California, differently than anywhere else in the country.
Thank you for bearing with us. A somewhat lengthy, hopefully informative video. I've been studying this stuff for years since I've been on the board, and I found that pretty interesting as well.
So,
So, bottom line, despite efforts to help school districts recover from the Great Recession by bringing school district spending power back to pre-recession levels, and by recession means 2008, growth in expenses to maintain operations means that school districts across the state are now experiencing the silent recession. There's a full report that this comes from. It's on the, we have a table where the district set up by those room dividers there too, if you want to check it out. It's from West Ed. All these resources will be available online as well if you're kind of a nerd like me and like to see something. So, without further ado, our keynote speaker, Dr. McFetters.
First of all, I want to thank you all for coming. I think this is a testament to how involved and how engaged the community is and has to be at this time. I think the video that you saw just recently that was done, I think, by KQED about the budget crisis was an important one for you to see today because that's exactly what's happening to the Cabrillo Unified School District right now. At the last board meeting, the county office came to us to say that we have not only a qualified budget, but a conditionally approved budget. And what that means is if we don't make cuts by December, actionable cuts, the county will come in and do county takeover. That is the area we're in right now. The Fiscal Crisis Management Assistance Team that you just saw, Mr. Fine, Michael Fine, his staff will be working with our staff in months ahead to make these cuts. And what I was told in the spring about what these cuts would look like are now more of double, if not triple, the amount that I was told. So on Thursday night at the board meeting, we will present unaudited actuals, a truing up of the budget, and you will see that we are saying that you need to cut a minimum of $1.75 million from the budget to $2.5 million from the budget in order for us to stay solvent in the district. And there's more to come. And that's not including the parcel tax of $1.6 million. I can't advocate for the parcel tax as an administrator and a staff member in the district, but if the parcel tax does not pass, add on another $1.6 million of cuts you will need to make in this district. And if it's not me and my staff and this board doing it, it will be someone from outside of the district, a county takeover, Fiscal Crisis Management Assessment Team, and you will pay an outsider to come in to cut and have no kind of understanding of the context. So I think that video is very important. I think it's very important what Sophia, our board president, has said about the silent recession. I urge you to look up silent recession, West Ed, because you will understand these factors that are coming up to us now like a perfect storm. The cost of pensions that have been passed on to us by the state, to the district and to employees, the costs of rising costs of special education costs, the costs of doing business, operational costs, gas, electric. How many of you know that Pacific Gas and Electric are planning on jacking up our fees for PG&E for electricity in the years ahead? How come we have pension costs that are increasing? Because legislators made sure that when investments for PERS and STIRS didn't come through, that they passed those costs on to districts, to our employees, and to our districts. So, again, K-12 education funding is inadequate and underfunded in California. When Jerry Brown said last year, we're coming back and funding local control funding formula fully, again, how many years ago was that? 2007, 2008 levels. And they're not talking about the shell game of legislators passing those pension costs to us. They haven't talked about our cost of living in the Bay Area. There's something wrong with this picture. There's increasing statewide advocacy right now. Some people have talked about AB 39, Assembly Bill 39, Muratsuchi, to increase the levels of funding formula. But again, right now that's just talk. We don't know if the governor is going to do that. And even so, we have budget fiscal prudence, where last year they didn't get this done. They took us some money away from us, gave us some other money. I just like to call it a shell game. And many districts are struggling with what we call a silent recession. It's silent because people aren't talking about it, people don't know about it. We need to talk about it. We need to advocate at the state level. Many districts rely on local parcel tax measures. Again, you have one here in Half Moon Bay and the coastside community in Cabrillo Unified School District. It's a renewal tax. I can't advocate for it as a staff member, but I can tell you what it means. It's $1.6 million. It's a renewal parcel tax. It's no more taxes than what the community's been paying before. And there are exemptions for seniors. There are exemptions for people with disabilities, and there are exemptions for contiguous parcels. And if it does not pass, it's another $1.6 million we have to cut. Tonight's presentation on unaudited actual shows that actually is a bullet point from Thursday night's presentation. We will have a presentation on unaudited actuals on Thursday night, and that will show you that we're forecasting significant budget gaps, our reserves have diminished, our costs continue to outpace our revenues. And so there's a host of reasons we talk about that. Everything costs more, pensions cost more, certain funding for services costs more, and the state also is not funding us to the levels we need. And finally, you'll see that last bullet says we need some kind of budget stabilization. That has to be in the form of increased revenues. That's either through a local parcel tax or through its budget cuts. And so we need to have a midterm plan for budget cuts, and then we'll have the long-term plan for increased revenue. And I will tell you, I drove recently to surplus property yesterday and last week to look at surplus property. The district has surplus property, but it will take us probably a year or more to sell surplus property, and that's a one-time solution. We have a problem with our budget that is going to be a structural deficit, and you can't wait for Superman to come send you money. We have to cut the budget in order to make our ends meet, or we will have a county takeover. If you look at the pie charts real quick, what you'll see, and I think the most important thing, is that 82% of CUSD funding is spent on employee salaries and benefits. We know that our employees across the board are struggling with how low our wages are. That's a problem. The Bay Area is not what it was 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. And this continues to be a problem, and yet we will have to cut services. We can't cut wages, but we will have to cut people probably from the budget. When you have 82% of it going to salaries and benefits, the only way to cut your way out of the problem is to cut services, to have layoffs, to consider school consolidations. These are heavy issues for this community. The community needs to be aware. I want you to know that. You'll see 8.4% of funding comes in from all other local sources, including a parcel tax, PTOs, and foundations. I want to speak to this. I had 2 meetings today, one on the Big Lift and one with the Chamber of Commerce. I am amazed at this community and how many donors and benefactors and philanthropists and just normal people have given day in and day out to this district. If you go to the high school, if we had the high school facilities, athletic facilities at my old district like you have here, we would think that we had died and gone to heaven. Cunha Building C, I know that was painful for years, but when you walk in that building, that's a 21st century state-of-the-art building, and any other district, that would be an envy from any other district. But again, that amount of funding is not going to save us. We have a funding deficit problem, and again, when you look at the expenses, we're going to have to cut those expenses, whether it be for services, contracts, but mostly it's salaries and benefits, 82%. And so I have to tell you, that's the cause that we have to align and rally behind now as a staff to present recommendations to cuts that the board can make in December to the tune of $1.5 to $2 million to $2.5 million in order to keep the wolves from the door and keep the lights on and to keep the county from coming over to do takeover. I'm sorry to report it. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but that is truth. If you look at the financial outlook, if you look at the bottom line, there's a lot of numbers here. Maybe you can't see it, but what is the color to the right bottom? Red. Your budget's in the red. We have to fix that problem. I don't want to fix blame. I know a lot of people want to say, why are we in that position? We're in that position simply for this reason. Our expenses exceed our revenues. Period. So what do we have to do? We have to cut our expenses, or we have to increase our revenues. A lot of good people in this room are trying to increase our revenues through local parcel tax. I can't advocate for it, they can. A lot of people are in this group, including one of our co-sponsors, is trying to do this at the legislative level. I wrote a letter myself about AB 39, Assembly Bill 39, last week to Senator Hill. We can hope and we can advocate at the state level, at the federal level, at the local level, but at the end of the day, this is the problem and the fiscal cliff we're looking at in years ahead. And so as a structural deficit, we have to start making cuts now because there's a multiplier effect over time. This financial planning process overview, you'll see, basically we're just trying to lay out the path ahead. On the left, you'll see identify the decision and the decision maker. Ultimately, the decisions about these issues rest with the Board of Education because they're publicly elected officials that represent you. The budget cuts to balance the budget must be presented by December 2019 to the board. It's my job to working with my staff to recommend those budget cuts. You'll see gathering inputs. We've been looking at budget cuts that were presented to us from last year from a committee. We are trying to true up those numbers, and we will present that to the public in weeks and months ahead, and then we will present it to the board to say, here's a list of cuts that we could make and the potential savings we could make. The bargaining group and PTO representatives have to be included in that. I've already met with CUTA, the Cabrillo Unified Teachers Association. I've already met with CSEA, our California School Employees Association, for our classified staff. I've told them that this is going to happen. We have to work with PTOs, the parent-teacher organizations. We have to work with our bargaining groups. We have to work with the board. We have to work with any community group possible, including our English language advisory councils, on and on and on. Today I met with the Chamber of Commerce. Today I met with Big Lift. We need to let people know of this problem. We will also need to work with the county and the Fiscal Crisis Management Assistance Team to show them what cuts we're going to make and why those decisions are made by best practices. If you see the assess and decide slide, we will make a recommendation and we'll basically make a proposal, and we'll start doing this by introducing the fact in October, November, and the board must decide in December. The county says so. Why? The county says so. Actionable cuts to the tune of anywhere between $1.5 to $2.5 million by December. Then we can start enacting those cuts. Now, meanwhile, you guys are all going to have like this kind of moment come January because Gavin Newsom's going to come out with a new budget. And everybody's going to feel like, yay, there's more money. But we've seen this happen before. This is what happened to us last year and the year before. They bring you new money, and then they say, wait a second, it's not going to be that much money. It's part of the reason why we're in the problem we're in now is that things were depended upon and expected, and then they did a switcheroo. So now we're like struggling with that. You cannot trust the state educational funding system, and remember, the governor will make a proposal in January, and that'll work its way, and we won't have a May revise until May of next year. So we have to prepare for cuts in December, knowing that there may be a changed financial outlook, which will be great, because maybe we won't need to make as many cuts. But right now, we have to make these cuts for the county, or they will take us over. Communication, I think I've already said that we will be talking in different venues. I will talk to anybody, I will go to any party, I will speak anywhere about this issue, but it's going to be the same message over and over again. Here's the problem we're in, these are the cuts we can make to get out of the problem. And then finally, to implement, I want to make sure that this sentence resonates with you. At the end of the day, these are your schools, these are your kids, these are your tax dollars at work. This is your future as an economy, as a place to live, as your American dream. All employees and community members ultimately have to come to understand the need for these budget cuts in order for the district to remain solvent. If you want to continue to have a democratically elected Board of Education, you have to make these cuts, because otherwise somebody's going to come over and take over and then make you take a loan, and then you saw the video. That loan will live with you for decades. I've watched it happen in Oakland. We've seen it and what it may do to Sacramento. This is a problem you don't want to be in. So everybody must get behind the idea that, yes, this is real, budget cuts are required. As far as the financial planning process, the timeline and the key milestones, they're up here. You'll see there's a September preparing. We'll have a finance overview update, and planning process. That's going to come Thursday night at the board meeting with our unaudited actuals. We finally have now the ability to show what the real number is. In October of 2019, we'll look at resource analysis, assessment of essential needs for district operations. The county office has suggested to us, you need to just have base program. Look at what your base program is. Everything else must go. So what that could mean is teachers in classrooms, but all those other things that we think is normal, that we think are needed, that we think are essentials, we may have to cut. You may see decrease in services with regard to counseling, with regard to psychologists, with regard to librarians, with regard to custodians, with regard to transportation. We will try to make savings through energy savings. We will try to scrimp and save. But at the end of the day, you don't get to a $2 million cut without cutting people. And those people will be not the essential people in the classroom. They will be people that we think are essential, but still we can't afford. You'll see in November that we'll discuss this with the board a second time. We'll now analyze the parcel tax election results. If it passes, that's 1.6 million we don't have to cut. We will have a scenario B. If the parcel tax does not pass, we will have a list of $1.6 million of annual cuts we will have to make also. And then you'll see there'll be a short-term report on the budget cuts ahead, and then in December, the board will have to decide, and we will have to inform the public, and we will have to tell the San Mateo County Office of Education what these cuts are going to be. It's not that we just inform San Mateo County Office of Education. It's actually the case that their Deputy Superintendent of Business Services, Denise Porterfield, comes to every single board meeting now until December, and she sits there to say, are you going to make these cuts? Because if we don't make the cuts, then they're in the wings saying, okay, we're going to have to do takeover. That's how serious the issue is at this point. I'm very optimistic, like the video said, that we're going to get more money from the state. I'm very optimistic that this community can rally around this and do this, because I understand you've done it in the past. I'm very optimistic because in my old district, we had to cut 1.6 million, but it was 3 times the budget of this. This is a large number of money. It is very sobering. I want to make sure everybody knows that I want to make sure we take care of people, but I also know that it means livelihoods. When you talk about layoffs, that means livelihoods for people. Do we have a good economy? Do we have a low joblessness rate? Are there jobs out there for people? Yes, indeed. But the truth of the matter is, I take this very seriously as part of my work because I know that lives are in the balance. People's paychecks are in the balance. People's vision of what they want for their lives and their kids are in the balance. In January and March of 2020, we will implement. We will do detailed work because we will have to prepare for a March 15 layoff for certificated employees. For classified employees, you have a longer sort of on-ramp because you only have to give 60 days notice. But we have to give March 15 notice for our certificated employees like teachers and psychologists and counselors and assistant principals, et cetera, et cetera. We'll have to give the layoff notices in March 15, and then we will restructure. Already, I want to let you know, people have asked me, well, Sean, what are you doing about this now? When a position becomes open because we have a resignation, I put a hiring freeze on that position. And we are basically saying, if someone resigns or retires, we have to look at whether or not that's an essential service or if we can get along. In the last few weeks, we've seen some people leave the district for retirement, resignation for other jobs. Those positions are on hold until we can determine whether or not we're going to be able to make other cuts. We will probably have a hiring freeze. And then April 20, you'll see that we will restructure that planning and implementation ongoing in 2020, and then we will start talking about strategic planning for other budget cuts. So the summary, the big picture of this, is what it means for you, whether you're in Montara, or Moss Beach, or El Granada, or Half Moon Bay, anywhere in the coastside community, any of our students, any of our staff, any of our employees, any of our families, conditional budget approval is what we've got, and that means we have to have actionable cuts by December, or we will be considered insolvent and the county could take us over. The parcel tax renewal outcome will determine the budget cut required. Again, I'm telling you that we have probably around 2 million in cuts we have to implement with a parcel tax. How much will we have to cut extra without a parcel tax? $1.6 million. I can't advocate for it. I can't advocate against it. But I can tell you information. If you don't pass a parcel tax, I will cut $1.6 million more of this budget. That's what I have to do. That's what I'm hired to do. That's what the law requires me to do. And the board will have to either accept those recommendations or risk a takeover of the district. It is a very difficult scenario. I know we can do it. I'm very optimistic. But these are daunting challenges. And I think it's important for us to really know that. Again, if the parcel tax doesn't pass, I want to make sure the class understands. How much more do we have to cut? 1.6 million. I can't advocate for it, but I can tell you what it means. I can give you information. These decisions on actual cuts must be made by the board in December. I think that is very clear to you. This is what we will do on September. This is September. On Thursday, we will present to the board the unaudited actuals. We will true up our budget. You will get a list of budget numbers to say what our cuts will be. And then October, November, and December, you will see that we will present to the board, we may have to make this cut, we may have to make this cut, and then in December, the board will be given a list of cuts, and they will basically make those choices. In October, November, and December, I will work to go to parent-teacher organizations, to work with bargaining groups, to talk to English language advisory councils, to talk to the Chamber of Commerce, to talk to the Rotary Club, to talk to anybody who will listen and invite me about this same presentation. I don't like this picture. What's wrong with this picture? We're in it. What's right with this picture? We can fix it. So, besides all that good news, you should have great pride in the school system. You should have great pride in the school system. The back-to-school nights that I've been to, the classrooms that I've visited, I think there's an incredible commitment of our educators here to do good work despite the odds. That said, the lack of funding from the state has finally caught up to us, and we have to make these cuts because the arrangements that you have in place currently have to change. Board President Sophia Lane and other board members who are here often remind me, Sean, this is a great opportunity for us to do the right thing and to make changes we wanted to change. But there will be people who will be attached to those changes. And so that weighs on me, and I'm mindful of it. And so I want you to be mindful of it. I want us to take care of each other. I want us to ask hard questions, but I also want us to make sure that we understand the situation, that we deal with it rationally and professionally, and that we take care of one another knowing that people will be impacted. You again have the second highest graduation rate of the unified school districts in the county. You have the third highest percentage of graduates achieving state university entrance requirements. You have the second highest percentage of graduates earning Golden State Seal Merit Diploma. We need to do better than that, but those are points of pride. The high school is doing a great job, the middle school is doing a great job, the elementary schools are doing a great job, the preschool is doing a great job, the adult school is doing a great job, but we can do better. And every CEO's job, every superintendent's job basically is, how do you improve services and cut costs? I believe we have to improve services in this district, and we can, if we are wise, if we're smart, and I believe we need to cut costs. The right side, again, is the issues that Sophia brought up. You have the 6th lowest per student funding level in the county. And you have a significant student opportunity gap that is driven by vastly differing socioeconomic and parent educational levels. 41% of our students and families are considered low income. So we need to do more on an equity level for students who are not yet performing at state standard. At this next board meeting, you will see an equity policy brought. We need to start looking particularly at our students and our families that need it the most. We need to look at an equity lens, and we need to drive our decisions on an equity lens about who needs our help the most. And we need to make cuts because we don't have enough money. So I can't wait to get to questions and answers. Thank you for listening to me. I hope that wasn't too sobering. And I think now we're going to turn to our panel and about how you can support student success.